Hi, I'm Corey Nathan, and this is Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other. Your home for edifying, provocative, and fun conversations among high-profile public figures and regular folks like me. We talk about faith and politics and all kinds of topics that really matter in our culture. So if you're tired of all the screamers out there taking all the oxygen out of the room and you want to join us in taking some of that space back, you'll love talking politics and religion without killing each other. Thanks for spending some time with us. Enjoy today's show. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I'm your host and so grateful to have a place to talk about faith and politics and big ideas in our culture with all kinds of interesting, accomplished folks of goodwill in good faith. Okay, I got to take a breath because there are some writers and some thinkers who've had a way of helping me understand my own faith and my own politics more clearly. And it's not a terribly long list for me, even shorter of the folks who are still with us and still writing. Theologians like N.T. Wright and J. Cameron Carter come to mind, novelist, essayist, Marilyn Robinson, as well as Wendell Berry would definitely be right up there. And then writers like David Brooks and Michael Gerson have a way of articulating what I've already been grappling with and always seeming to bring some clarity to the chaos. Today's guest, Peter Wehner, is most certainly on that list. Peter worked in the Reagan and George H.W. Bush administrations. In the George W. Bush White House, Pete was deputy director of speechwriting before becoming director of the Office of Strategic Initiatives. He was also involved in President Bush's 2004 re-election campaign, as well as Mitt Romney's presidential campaign in 2012. He is also a contributing writer to the New York Times, which is where he wrote a column in January of 2016 that he would not be voting for Donald Trump under any circumstances. In fact, he wrote a piece as early as July of 2015 saying, just say no to Donald Trump. Pete is a contributing editor to at The Atlantic and is the author of The Death of Politics, How to Heal Our Frayed Republic After Trump. How indeed. Pete Wehner, what an honor to have you. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for the very generous introduction, Corey. It's great to be with you, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, me too. Me too. I've been I'm a consistent reader of your work in various platforms, but the last few days I've definitely been more ensconced than usual. So I have lots of questions.
Good. I hope I have some sufficient answers. And looking forward to a conversation with you too.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that caught my attention right at the beginning of the new book, it's not, what was it, 2019? Yeah. But one of the things that you mentioned at the beginning, you mentioned that your parents, Alfred and Inga, is that how you say it? Inga?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Immigrated to America from Germany. So I was curious, when was that, under what circumstances, and how did their experience ultimately shape your own theological and political beliefs?
Yeah, it's a good question. My mom immigrated, came over when she was 13 years old, and so that would have been she was born in 1919, so it would have been in the 30s. My dad came later in the early 50s. It actually turned out that the person who sponsored my dad for immigration was my mom's mother, and she had been in Germany and had dental work needed. My dad was working in dentistry, and that connection was made. So that's how my parents met, actually through that. I'm not sure that experience that they had much of an influence on my faith journey. It may have, but I'm not aware of what it would have been. And I'm happy to talk to them about my faith journey and my own experience with my parents. I do think it influenced my views on politics in several ways. I developed an interest in politics at a pretty young age. It was natural to me. It wasn't anything that was, that my parents consciously and intentionally decided to impart on me. I just found myself interested in world events and politics, not obsessively so. I was very interested in sports and other things, but I was always drawn to it. My first conscious memory of really thinking about politics was when I was in sixth grade, which was the McGovern-Nixon election in 1972. And there was a girl in my class, Margaret Haney, who was a McGovern supporter, and I was a Nixon supporter because my parents were, somewhat Republican leaning and conservative. They were not ideological or particularly partisan. But as I got older, I would talk about politics with them, primarily my dad, but really with both of them. They had a world perspective. My dad, in particular, had traveled a lot, was mostly interested in international affairs. And so we had a lot of conversations about that. But not only that, we used to watch the news together and have a lot of conversations. When I was in junior high, social studies was my favorite class. My teachers were liberal. As I said, I was more conservative. At that time, there was a pretty intense debate about the Vietnam War. My views were not well shaped. Again, I think they were largely shaped by my parents, which is often the case with kids. But over time, I adopted my own views in terms of public policy and conservatism as a political philosophy. And so I think my parents had a big influence on my interest in politics. The other thing that they, I think, influenced was they had a real deep love of country, and often it manifests itself most in immigrants. They see America through different eyes, and sometimes eyes that are more drawn to America, partly because their experiences can be so much different and worse. And my parents would tell me that America was sort of a beacon to much of the rest of the world. And so they had a kind of immigrant's love for the country, which I think was imparted to me.
What was the circumstance? I'm trying to place you. You said your mom was born in 1919. Mm-hmm. So she would have been, I don't know if they were engaged theologically as Christians when they were in Germany, but one of my favorite heroes of the 20th century, early 20th century, was Bonhoeffer.
Yeah.
So I was curious if there was any connection there.
There wasn't. Interestingly, I have a good friend, Tobias Kremer, who's teaching at Oxford, whose grandfather, maybe his great-grandfather, knew Bonhoeffer because he taught in Germany and was a minister at that time, actually. And so he was part of that small and courageous group of the confessional church resisting the German national church in the 20s and 30s in Germany. My parents were not. My theology, my faith really wasn't shaped tremendously by my parents. I don't really have much of a memory of going to church when I was younger. My dad, I think, when I began my journey of faith, sort of at the end of high school and into college, my dad was, I think, at that point, an agnostic. He had grown up Catholic, turned atheist in his 20s, not in a hardened or aggressive way, but just didn't believe in God, moved toward agnosticism. And only at the end of his life, or later part of his life, did he adopt faith, long after I had. And my two sisters actually came of faith. We were all independent of each other. My mom, I was in a sense, believed in God, but wasn't imparting church teaching or church doctrine. It was more of just a belief that there was a good God who was active in the world. So my journey of faith was really independent of them.
So you and Curtis on a recent podcast of their Curtis's and David's great podcast, Good Faith.
Yeah.
I think you had mentioned that you shared the same mentor in college. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Wehner?
Yeah, Steve. His name was Steve Wehner, and Steve had a number of mentees over the course of his life. I met Steve. Well, the context is Steve, when I met him, was the student youth minister at University Presbyterian Church in Seattle. So I went to University of Washington, and UPres was a church that a lot of students attended. And Steve was the organizer and leader of a group called the Inn. And when Steve took that over in the early 70s, I think, there were about 30 people that gathered in a building that was next to University Presbyterian, the main sanctuary, the main church. But when I got there, I started school in the fall of '79 and I went through to, UW after that. There were about 900 people that would come. It would be Tuesday nights. I think it was 10 o'clock, if I remember, 9 or 10 o'clock at night. And it was a worship service in which there was singing, usually contemporary Christian songs. Steve would, deliver a message. There was communion. So the model, the format, the paradigm, the template was not unusual by any means. What made it unusual was really Steve. And when I think the reason Steve had such an impact on Curtis and me and so many other friends of ours was his integrity, both theological and as a person. He was very, very thoughtful and wise, a wonderful listener. And he had a kind of inviting personality. I remember when I was in college, I was struggling with some issues that I'd never shared with anybody else. In retrospect, they really weren't that big issues, but I didn't know that at the time. They had really been inflated, partly because I hadn't shared them with anybody. And I decided I would share them with Steve. And so I still remember walking to his office. I think it was a Tuesday afternoon around 3 o'clock. And I was so nervous about it, I almost turned around and decided I'm not going to go through with it, but I did. And I began to talk to him, share with him. And he was just wonderful. And that really was part of the kind of, I think, ministry that Steve had. And of course, that creates a deep bond with you if you feel like if you're having some struggles and someone is there to listen well to you, to walk the journey with you. And so over the course of my life, Steve was involved in key moments. He became president of InterVarsity for 13 years. And then he became president of Columbia Theological Seminary in Georgia. And he tragically passed away of pancreatic cancer in 2015. But Steve was a model to me, and one of those people that, when you walk through life, live life, and think through how to act, and in my case, what to write, what to say, how to conduct oneself in human relationships with the people you love, people you don't love. I try and think about certain people, or not try to think, they just pop into my mind, and I do think, what would they say? What would their view be of what I'm saying or doing? And Steve is one of those people, and those kind of people are important because they can be good checks on how you live your life.
It's a real blessing to have folks that act as somewhat of a moral compass. You can look down and it's almost flipped to say, what would Jesus do, or something like that. But to have real individuals whose face and just entire countenance you can imagine before you when you're making certain decisions, or just even in the moment, to have that as a compass. And now that you describe Steve, I think you mentioned him in a piece, gosh, it must be 3 or 4 years ago. You've done this series of pieces for the New York Times right before Christmas. And that particular piece was on grace. And his testimony in his last days, when he realized that it wasn't a matter of years, but a matter of weeks or months. And he died not too long after that. But what really caught my attention, somebody that you've collaborated with a number of times, Jonathan Rauch, I think you asked him, and forgive me if I don't have it all clear, but I think you asked him his understanding of grace. Do you remember that? And do you remember what he said?
I do. It was John is a close friend of mine, and John is not a believer. He's Jewish, atheist, and gay. So I've met John, I don't know, I guess the first time was around the mid 1990s. So we knew each other, but the friendship has really grown over recent years in particular. And John is a wonderful and wise person. And what you're referring to is that I had sent Steve, who had been doing some writings during his on the Caring Bridge, And so he was sort of a journal of his walk through cancer and toward death. And it was one that he and his wife, Cheryl, did together. And this thing ended up being visited by like hundreds of thousands of people. It really, really resonated because it was so faithful, so vulnerable, so transparent. I mean, it was very true to Steve. So I think it offered, in a way, people who wouldn't have otherwise known Steve. Those words were insights into who he was. And there was one particular post near the end of Steve's life that I found quite moving, and I sent a link to it to John, and he wrote back. I don't have the exact words, but he wrote back and he said, I don't. Couple of things, I think. One was I still don't fully understand what grace is, but when I see people live their lives, move toward death the way Steve is, I understand it better, and that it's people like that who made him wish that he could believe. The way John has described it to me, and I think publicly, is he's sort of colorblind on faith. It's just at a frequency that he doesn't hear. And he realizes other people are able to see those colors, but he's not. And there's certainly downsides.
That's a really interesting way to describe it. Some
Yes.
folks can hear notes in between the 88 keys on the piano.
Right.
That's a really interesting, that it may very well be, but he simply doesn't hear it or see it.
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful analogy, and very helpful to me. So we've, John and I have talked about those matters, but it was interesting to me that the power of the Christian faith, when I think it's lived out in an authentic way, can really reach people, even people who are not believers. And the thing that I think most cuts through the noise and most reaches people who are not followers of Jesus, and those who are manifestations of grace. Because I think that is a concept that is largely, if not alien to the rest of the world, it's difficult to understand. And anytime people, I think, see authentic grace expressed, it can be a very moving thing and touch people's hearts. Again, even people who are not believers.
Yeah, I've said on occasion that I have more empirical proof of the existence of God, but I couldn't prove it to anyone else. It's for me, and
Right.
The other most empirically verifiable thing in creation is that, well, number one, there is a God, but number two, I ain't God. So,
Right.
but again, it's one of those ironic things where I can't prove that to anybody else, but it's more provable to me.
Right. Oh, that's a very important point. I agree with you. What's important to us may not be important to other people. And in the end, right, it is faith. It's not a logical proposition.
But grace is one of those virtues that I have yet to find a persuasive argument in some folks who are friends of mine who are atheists. There's a lot of explanations for some qualities in human condition and how we relate to each other that can be explained through evolution. But a lot of other creatures evolved in a certain way that are perfectly explainable. I think I don't find any contradictions, frankly, with the evolution. But grace is one of those things that I don't find any explanations other than the existence of God. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It does make sense. I mean, I think it is a concept that is very difficult to parse or cohere apart from a perspective with God. It may not be impossible. I haven't thought through it carefully enough, but I certainly think that God and in particular the Christian story and narrative makes grace much easier to apprehend. There are, of course, people who are not believers, not Christians, who themselves embody grace, and someone like John Rausch is one of them. But I do think that that people who, as a general matter, even people who might be oriented toward grace, grace toward the world, grace toward other people, the capacity for forgiveness, I do think that you have more tools in the toolbox if you're a person of the Christian faith. It's so absolutely central to Christianity, rightly understood. One of the books that had a big impact on me, and one of my favorite authors is Philip Yancey, and he wrote a book in the later part of the 1990s called What's So Amazing About Grace. He also wrote a book called The Jesus I Never Knew, which had a big influence on me and also my daughter, who's a big Philip Yancey fan. And that's a really good place to start if somebody wants to understand grace. And it helped me understand grace better than I did, for sure.
Yeah. I think you also quoted something from C.S. Lewis, who's another very, very approachable, very literate. And he comes from a place of understanding what it means to not believe, if not actually shaking your fist at the possibility of a God.
No, I was just going to say, it's interesting. I'm actually reading right now, dabbling back into a couple of books that I've read through before, but one is the Reluctant Convert by I'm drawing a blank on his name, and also The Inklings, which is a book written in the late 1970s by Humphrey Carpenter, I think is his name.
I was going to mention, but it's a different book. It's an account. It's a really thorough account of the Inklings that was written. It wasn't in the late 70s.
Fellowship?
The Fellowship. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that was right. That was a book that was written, recently. I mean, within I think the last decade or so. And that was the last sort of major book that had been written, or the most recent major book that had been written after this one by, I think it's Humphrey Carpenter, I think is his name. It was, that's such an extraordinary group of people, the Inklings, such an important literary group, and Lewis and Tolkien and Barfield and Charles Williams and so forth. It was interesting that Russell Moore, who's a friend of mine and formerly part of the Southern Baptist Convention, for a variety of reasons left it. And Russell had a crisis of faith when he was 15. And I've talked to him about the power and the influence of C.S. Lewis on his life. Lewis was an important figure in my life, maybe yours. He influenced a lot of people. But what Russell said is it wasn't simply or even mainly what Lewis wrote. It was how he wrote, that there was a winsomeness to Lewis, a lack of defensiveness, obviously an intellectual integrity, and there was an accessibility to it. And there was just a posture toward the world that Lewis had. It was sort of at ease with the world, was not hard-edged, and met people, I think, where they were, that really sort of invited Russell in, and has invited millions and millions of other people in over the decades.
I'm Brian Kaler, the award-winning podcast host of Dangerous Dogma, the authority on questioning authority. If you're a fan of Joel Osteen, Paula White, or John MacArthur, then this is not the show for you. On Dangerous Dogma, we challenge dangerous teachings found in various strands of Christianity, while also taking seriously Jesus' own teachings that lead us into dangerous places. Listen wherever you get your podcast or at dogma.wordandway.org.
I had the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Moore not too long ago, and one of the profound takeaways was when we were talking about his own crisis of faith, and something that you were talking about just a few minutes ago was having mentors that you can imagine what they might say in any given situation, or they serve as somewhat of a guide, if even in your imagination. Well, one of mine was Ravi Zacharias. I had a really close relationship with Ravi. We called him Ravi G. And I was sharing that with Dr. Moore, and it was very helpful what he said. I won't go into all of it, but at the end of I think it's when we were talking about apologia, where apologia is mentioned, gentleness and respect, and it kind of expanded into a larger discussion about scripture. And at the end of the day, my takeaway was that Ravi's failures and the damage that he did, and the damage that's still being cleaned up or dealt with, I should say, is doesn't make scripture any less true. Mm-hmm. You know, it's, and now I'm just thinking out loud, but the creator God, even from just a literary standpoint, the creator God was good and perfect and sovereign. And, you know, he is, you know, and at the very beginning in chapter 3, the human creature's failures didn't make God any less God. It didn't make God any less good. In fact, that's kind of what the story is about, right? That's kind of what this whole project is about. That in order for that, and again, this isn't a well-formed thought, so I'm really just thinking out loud. In order for that love to be of value, it needs to be a freely chosen love. For Adam and Eve to be in communion with their creator God, they need to have freely chosen that. But those creatures being not God, it was almost inevitable that at some point they would choose otherwise, you know. Right. But the goodness of God is in that he accounted for all that. That was all planned for, you know. And then the rest of the story is about how he goes about redeeming his creation, how he goes about allowing for us to participate in that redemption project, you know, initially through Abraham and his descendants and my people, and then around the person of Jesus, sort of continued and discontinued in many significant ways. So sorry, I'm kind of
that was very I appreciated you sharing that, and I think there's a lot of wisdom in what you said and in what Russell said. You know, I'd only say about that. Well, the first thing is I completely agree. I believed, actually was one of the earliest thoughts I had in my Christian journey, was that you know, if I was going to believe in Christianity, it really depended fully on who Jesus was. And if he was who he claimed to be and who Christianity insists that he was, then that would command my allegiance, no matter what. And if he wasn't, I wasn't going to participate in it, no matter what it would do to my life, if it would create meaning or anything else. I didn't want to give my allegiance to something that was a lie. Having said that, this is not contradicting what you or Russell said. It's just maybe putting a caveat on it or an addendum to it. That when you see people like him fall and fail, and so many others, and when you see, in my estimation, what's happened to the Christian church, particularly the evangelical church in America in recent years, where I think so much harm has been done, so much discrediting has been done, it just it has a catastrophic effect on the witness of the church, because ultimately we give our allegiance in a faith, in our case, to Jesus, but also to a community. And the people who most shape our lives, like we were talking about earlier, tend to be people in our lives. They walk with us through the journey. They help shape our own views. You know, we are relational people. And if the people who purport to be the best representatives of the faith fail in such massive ways, fail in ways that injure and wound other people, in the way that Ravi Zacharias and so many others have done, so many scandals that have plagued the church, the Me Too movement, the way Russell's been treated, and Beth Moore in the Southern Baptist Convention, that shakes people, a lot of people, to their core. And it certainly creates a huge obstacle to people who aren't of faith, because they say, look, this is a freak show. Why would I want to join this? I had a conversation with a very close friend of mine, Carl Kopic, who was quite important in my own journey of faith. The first Bible study that I went through when I wasn't even a believer was with Carl. And I went back to Washington State a couple of years ago, and we were having breakfast together. And he used the phrase generational catastrophe in terms of the gap between what our faith calls us to be and what is often playing out in our lives. And when you think about, we're supposed to be, stars like stars shining in the night sky. And when people fail in huge ways, and in so many different ways, that is a huge, huge, huge problem. I'd be curious, how have you processed, since you were close to Ravi Zacharias? I was not, I've never met him, and he wasn't a particularly influential figure to me. I was just horrified, obviously, by what he did. But how have you processed it, and how have you made sense of it? And has it altered in any respect your own view of faith or Christians, or how Christians should walk this journey?
Yeah, I'm still processing, to be honest with you. Interestingly, I had a conversation I became friends with Ravi's kids because they were closer in age to me. So I had a conversation with one of his kids the other day, just a couple of days ago, and just still processing. I realized that this wasn't the first time that I deferred to someone and was made myself very, very teachable, which can be a good quality, that ultimately proved. To say there were character flaws is, I almost hesitate to say it, because they're victims, and I don't want to sound dismissive, as if he boasted everyone, like it's the kinds of things that really have victims that are going to shape lives and families for many, many years to come. So there have been a number of things that I've actively tried to do. I had a conversation, a good friend of mine studied at Duke. He's a teacher at Fuller now. And his specialty is ethics, New Testament ethics, really dear, dear friend of mine. And I had a conversation. I've had numerous conversations with Tommy about it. There was one that we kind of recorded, actually, because I thought it was important. A lot of folks who know me, as well as folks who listen to this program, know that Ravi was a very influential figure in my life and my theological formation. So I thought it was important to have one of those conversations, and share it with listeners here. So we included Tommy and Amy Laura, another ethics professor from Duke, at Duke Divinity School. And so that was helpful. It forced me to think through. It's almost like there are potholes that I have to traverse, and then there's obstacles that get in my way that I bang up against, and I just need to work it through. I need to understand it. I need to understand it, partly to just be fearful and candid and brutally candid with myself, that I'm not that far removed from that possibility, So not to beat myself up or take a flagellum or anything, but to reckon with the reality that this malfunction in creation, this sin thing, it's in creation, but I'm in it. I'm in it too, So again, I'm not being very articulate right now because it's still kind of a mess for me. But conversations like that, or parts of conversations like I had with Dr. Moore, good friends, talking with Sarah the other day, these are all little drops of grace, if you will, to help me make sense of it, to help me reckon with it, also to help me reckon with where is my own culpability. And is there anything I can, because there is damage there. And to the degree that I advocated for him and celebrated his who he was in the world, there's at the very least, there's that culpability. So to what degree can I heal that damage that I participated in? So there's a lot there. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's
no, it's a very moving and transparent and articulate expression of what you're going through, and it's really, really hard. I mean, there was obviously no way that you would have known what he was doing, and he influenced a lot of people. I mean, I know folks. It's a reason that his ministry was as important as it was, and excuse me, and it's as influential as it was. And that's why people who have those kind of leadership positions have an extra obligation to live their lives with some degree of some measure of integrity, and certainly not to live in such a corrupt and malicious way. But it's hard. It's hard to do, and at some point, it just gets tiresome to have to make the argument that to other people and even to ourselves that we have to separate, who Jesus is and who his followers are. The gap's not supposed to be that wide.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, if you read the words of Paul, who fully acknowledges obviously that we're all sinful and fallen, but there's a notion of being a new creation, of a transformed life. And I think what happens in my experience is a lot of people mouth those words and not in a cynical way. I don't think. For a lot of them, they do it because I think, one, it's the language of the community, right? There's a certain Christian vernacular. But I think some of it is that they really want to feel that way, and they've convinced themselves they feel that way. And sometimes there's a kind of an emotional crescendo in various times that, and worship where you feel like, this is, I'm a different person than I was. But then everyday reality sets in, and those temptations and those fault lines that exist in all of us, that are supposed to be at least mitigated to some extent for people who are followers of Jesus, that kind of gets obliterated, and then sometimes it's even worse in people who are Christians, because they're kind of blind to it. There's a spiritual arrogance. They think that they're immune to those things, or that these kind of very twisted theological rationales kick in. And people can kind of convince themselves, the human capacity to rationalize, to convince ourselves that anything that we're doing can be justified is an amazing thing. And that's why we all need people in our lives. Back to earlier topic we were talking about, who can act as checks on that, and when necessary, can speak into our lives and say, "Look, you've got to stray here. You've got to reset."
So you've been a Christian, as you said, since you were in college, and it looks like you went into politics relatively early on. Like it must have been your early 20s, right, that you started working in the Reagan administration, right?
Yeah. It was mid-20s. I was a speechwriter for William Bennett, who was Secretary of Education in the second Reagan term.
Okay, Secretary of Education. There's a few different questions that I have. Part of it is my kind of career hat that's on, like, how do you get a job like that? But part of it to what we're talking about is, I think I had a sensitivity to where folks were putting extra biblical or even anti-biblical values ahead of actual scripturally founded values. Early on, because as a Jew, I didn't come to Christ until I was 29 years old. Mm-hmm. So as a Jew, we have this like allergy, if you will, to it. It was my grandmother who actually, this is interesting. So she lived in Cherny Ostra. The Krivals and the Blicks, my side of the family, my father's side of the family, lived in Cherny Ostrov in Ukraine. For at least 150 years to what we can figure, possibly considerably longer. We're just trying to track with where Jewish emigration was. Mm-hmm. But they were very prominent. My great-grandfather was mayor of the town, and they had mills and very successful. And it wasn't exactly the same as it is now, but there were a lot of similarities in 1919. Leading up to, I think they left in the fall of 2020. And they actually landed on Ellis Island on March 3rd, 1921. So the reason I bring this story up is that, number one, everybody hated the Jews. So it wasn't just the guys wearing crosses on their chests, but it was typically right around this time of year, after Easter, where the guys with the crosses on their helmets or their chests were swinging swords, burning down their houses, raping our neighbors, beheading, or it was terrible atrocities that were committed. And not to say that these guys were akin to our brothers and sisters from church that we're in Bible study with, but it was those kinds of things and historical atrocities just like it that gave us as Jews a particular sensitivity to it. Yeah. So when I became a Christian, it was 2000, and not too long after that, my buddy Tommy actually came to the church where I was going. It was 2002, and this is something where I think you and I might have some disagreements about. But it was in the lead up to the Iraq part of the war, and he was teaching on Romans, and he was at that time he was very influenced. I don't know if you're familiar with John Howard Yoder's work. Yeah, there's another one that's Anyway, it's very profound stuff. Howard Wasser's a big influence for Tommy, but he was teaching on Romans and was coming to these coming to conclusions, and I thought pretty well founded scripturally, of non-violent resistance was more the Christian way, if you will, and I'm putting it in more simplistic terms than he would. But he didn't even mention Iraq, but there was such an uproar in the church that was my first experience with this sort of thing, that it sounded like, anti-Republican, anti-American, all the things that I was like, whoa, is this stuff more important than the Bible? Yeah. To the extent that Tommy would never be able to teach in that church again. So anyway, all that as background to ask, you have been very early warning, the raising the flag and saying, hey, this whole Trump thing, this is a no-go, right. But were there other times in your career or just in your life going to church where this marriage, if you will, was concerning to you? Or was it not until it really we really started to see Christian nationalism come to the foreground? Or what has that been like for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. No, it was not new to me when the Trump era. I've written about warnings. It's actually interesting. The first thing that I think I ever had published was a letter in the Tri-City Herald, which was the newspaper in a place called Richland, with Tri-Cities, Richland, Pasco, Kennewick, and Southeast Washington. That's where I grew up. And it was published in December of 1980, so I was in college at the time. And it was a letter in response to a guy whose last name was Mays. And he had written something in the Tri-City Herald that conjoined the Reagan agenda with Christianity and the right-wing agenda, conservative agenda, opposition to the ERA, and defense spending, and a whole series of other things. I think Second Amendment, and so forth. And and I was sort of conservative at the time. Some of the stuff I disagreed with him. Some I would probably agree with him. But the reason I wrote that note, and this is early on in my Christian pilgrimage, is that I said that this conflation of Christianity with a political agenda was very dangerous. And the last line in the piece, in that letter that I wrote, was something to the effect that Jesus died for Republicans, independents, and maybe even a few Democrats. And so that was almost as early as I became a Christian. I was wary of the conflation of power, political power, and politics with Christianity. I wrote a piece in the 1990s for the Brookings Review, which was a screw tape letter. I did it in the model of Lewis and screw tape letters, warning on exactly this issue of the twinning of faith and politics in a negative way. Mike Gerson and I wrote a book in 2010 called City of Man, Religion and Politics in a New Era. We were both alarmed by the sort of Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson misuse of faith. So that's been something that's been consistent in my entire Christian life. the Trump era was just a particularly awful manifestation of it, and I think probably a cautionary tale of what happens when you're not alert to it, where it can end up.
Well, there's so much more to dig into here, but I don't want it to be all dire because in your book, one of the things that you do in The Death of Politics is the subtitle is How to Heal Our Frayed Republic After Trump. Are you still as hopeful that we can heal? And if so, how do we do it?
Yeah, it's I don't know if I'm hopeful that we're going to heal. I mean, I hope we do. Do I expect that we will? I think over time we will. I should say that a friend of mine years ago said that it's fine to be a theoretical pessimist, but you should be an operational optimist. And
I like that. So expound on that for me.
Well, regardless of what your theory of how theoretically how things unfold or how they eventually end, and I think I'm temperamentally, like I think most people, pretty hopeful about that. But even if you weren't, you have to act operationally optimistic. That is, you have to believe that one has the capacity, individuals have capacity to change events. Cultures and countries have the capacity to change events and to pursue justice and to move us closer to justice.
That sounds like our founding fathers.
Yeah, no, it's very much this sense of we live in a broken and a fallen world, and we're not going to make it a completely just. It's not going to be an Edenic, life on this world. It's fallen, but all of us in our individual lives and collectively, we can nudge things along. I think Obama used the phrase "a more perfect union." We can nudge things along toward justice, and we have to find out ways to do it. And you can't be paralyzed because you think, look, this is hopeless. This is such an overwhelming problem. There's nothing to do. Years ago, a friend of mine used an illustration. He said, here he was talking about one's own life. But sometimes when you feel like your own life is scattered or broken or you're overwhelmed. He said, it's like if you walk into a room and the room is, the bed's unmade and there are clothes all over the floor and books are all scattered and it's just an utter mess. He said, you can either stand there and look, not doing anything and say, this is just an awful mess. I can't envision cleaning this up. Or you can pick up the socks at your feet and put them away, put them in the laundry hamper. And then you go to the next thing, and then you go to the next thing. Yeah. And then over time, the room gets cleaned up. So those are all, I think, helpful ways to view it. I would say on the positive side, maybe on the hopeful side, several things. The first is that we've had worse periods in American history than this, for sure. I mean, we did have a civil war where in a country of 29 million, 700,000 died. That would be the equivalent of 7 million people to today. And then you had the terrible Reconstruction afterward, and then you had Jim Crow, segregation. You had the founding of the country, the Adams-Jefferson, first really legitimate contested election in American history in 1800 was a brutal affair. And if you read historians, they'll said that almost, tore the young republic apart. We even had, in the late 1960s, early 1970s, tremendous convulsions, cultural convulsions. You had the sexual revolution, the generation gap, the Vietnam War, the Black Power movement, riots in the streets, Kent State, on and on, in a really, compressed period of time, as I said. So this has happened, and the American capacity for self-renewal is I think, pretty impressive. And the other thing I would say is that an awful lot of people that I know are not happy with the state of things in America, the political and civic culture that we're dealing with right now, which means that there is what social scientists refer to as the exhausted majority. A lot of people who are seeing something want to change, and they're not sure exactly how to do that. But those people exist, and I guess in the spirit of Tocqueville, there is an American habit of mind and heart to fix things, often at a local level, but to see these problems and to repair the wounds. And I see an awful lot of people trying to do that, to think creatively about what can be done to heal. I see it in the evangelical world because there's so much, in my estimation, the estimation of a lot of friends of mine, a lot of ruin, not complete ruin by any means, but a lot of ruin that we've seen. And people are trying to think creatively and intentionally about how that can be rebuilt. And it's also a sense that, I don't think human beings are meant, flourishing doesn't take place in this kind of an environment in terms of the political culture, with so much antipathy, so much mutual contempt, so much hate. And so I hold out the hope that I used an analogy prior to the pandemic, where I said sometimes viruses create their own antibodies. I think I write about that in the book. And sometimes in an individual life, as well as the life of a country, there are certain qualities, virtues that we take for granted, and when they're stripped away from us, we're reminded why they mattered in the first place. And sometimes when things like honor and integrity and human decency are stripped away, we see why they actually matter, and you want to fight for them. Even I would say in this moment, I've been struck by the almost electric effect that President Zelensky of Ukraine has had, not just on people in this country, but throughout the Western world, because it's such a courageous struggle. It's of course filled with just horror in terms of what Russia is the decimation and the death and the ruin that's visiting Ukraine, but the courage and the love of country and the honor that we're seeing in Zelensky's own words. And you could see that that's stirring the human heart, for a lot of people. So those things are there. I think it's both tapping into it, in a sense, animating those better angels, or empowering the better angels of our nature, and then trying to figure out programmatically in all sorts of realms, what does that mean? What does it mean in the political realm? What does it mean in the realm of faith? What does it mean in the realm of one's own family life and in their in one's neighborhood? One person acting alone may not make much of a difference, but a lot of people acting together can create a culture. And so I have a sense that people want to do that and are starting to do it. At the same time, we're very deeply, deeply polarized, the most polarized since the Civil War. And one thing that's particularly worrisome to me is that a lot of people have just taken an off-ramp from truth and reality. And that's just very hard, because if you can't have a common set of facts or agree on certain truth propositions, that makes politics in a free society pretty difficult.
Yeah, I think you asked that question, and it was the piece, I want to say it came out yesterday. How do we repair the breach and achieve some measure of social peace? I found actually your answer somewhat surprising, because part of the answer, candidly, is that we have to fight those who, as you say, can't be reached by reality. So how do we fight those who can't be reached by reality? But how do we also provide an on-ramp back to reality, as you would say, for those who can?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing is disaggregation, wise disaggregation, to try and figure out who it is that that one is dealing with. And this Atlantic essay that you're referring to was focused in on the email exchanges between Ginny Thomas and Mark Meadows. Ginny Thomas was a conservative activist, wife of Clarence Thomas, Supreme Court Justice. Mark Meadows at the time was a chief of staff for President Trump, and this was all surrounding the claims that the election was stolen. And what you saw there, I think why it was a helpful set of exchanges to read. There were 29 texts in all. They probably exchanged a lot more than that, but 29 were shared with Bob Woodward and Robert Costa, two journalists. You saw what a distorted, disturbed, and dark world they were in, and particularly with Ginny Thomas, she is a true believer. It's hard to know whether Mark Meadows believed all of it or whether he was playing along with some of it. they're not reachable, at least not now. And you have to just keep those people from power. All right. You've in this very concrete, specific way, keep Donald Trump from winning again in 2024, and to the degree possible, defeat people who are Trump acolytes from winning in the House and the Senate. But for people who are reachable, and those are people that may be somewhere on that continuum that Meadows and Thomas are on, but not to that degree. And they may be inflamed now, but they may not be inflamed later. So the question then is, well, how are those people reached? And there are different ways to do it. I do know that in my own life experience, both in terms of how I am and my own interactions with people who see things very differently than I do, who are Trump supporters, that you're not going to bludgeon them into your position. You're not going to overwhelm them with data. You're not going to out-argue them. In my experience, to the degree that I've had what I think are successful interactions with others, a lot of it is, I think, listening well and listening to their story, helping them to feel like they're not dishonored or viewed with contempt, and to find some kind of often areas of agreement or connection in realms other than politics. So there's a sort of trust that builds up. And if you have a relationship in which there's trust, even affection or warmth in other areas, then I think both sides are more willing to listen to the other person when it comes to politics, and to entertain the notion that maybe there's another perspective that exists. I read out in the book a friend of mine who's in sort of right-wing Inc., the sort of conservative right-wing talk radio world. And I had written something in the New York Times. This was at the time that Trump fired James Comey, and he was upset about it. So we had an email exchange. Once we were getting to about the third set of exchanges, I could just tell that the temperature was changing, that he was getting angry. He was starting to make accusations about me. And probably, 10 or 15 years ago, I would have done a point-by-point rebuttal to what he had done. And, in my estimation, left it, his arguments in a smoldering ruin, which would have been completely useless. It may have been therapeutic for me to vent temporarily, but it wouldn't have convinced him of anything, and it would have damaged our relationship, and it would have required time and effort to repair that damage. So what I ended up doing is saying, so and so, look, I'm not going to answer the charge you're making against me unless you really want me to. Let me try and explain how I think you see the world, and let me explain how I see the world. And I did my level best to try and articulate how he viewed me and how he viewed his role, which was, this is a person who is loyal to Trump. He believes at the time that the success of Trump was connected to the success of the country. He felt like I was somebody who should have known better, given my lifelong experience in the Republican Party and as a conservative. There was a kind of betrayal that I was no longer on the team. And for him, the loyalty, the virtue is loyalty. He sort of viewed himself, I would say, as a lineman trying to protect his quarterback, Donald Trump. And for me, it was intellectual integrity. It was the question, if Barack Obama or Bill or Hillary Clinton had done the same things that Donald Trump had done, what would I say about them? And what am I saying about him? And if the reason that I'm giving him a break and I'm coming down on them like a ton of bricks is because they're Democrats and Trump is a Republican and I'm a Republican, and therefore the argument isn't really in any sense honest, it's tribalistic, that to me is a problem. And that's just how I come at these issues. So I laid these both scenarios out in a relatively objective way. And he wrote back and he said, it was like a light bulb going on. I read your note 2 or 3 times. And he said, I remember him saying, I'm not interested in being objective. I'm an advocate. But in that exchange, he was understanding my point of view. I was understanding his point of view. And then sometime after that, I was on the GW Parkway driving into work, the GW Parkway here in the DC area. And it was in the context of a mass shooting that had taken place. And it was one in Florida in which some of the students were leading a movement against a gun control movement, which he very much disagreed with. But I heard him say to his audience, disagree with these high school students if you want on the Second Amendment. I don't agree with them either, but don't go after them personally, that they had just been through a very traumatic experience where their classmates had been gunned down. And I remember he used the phrase that I've got socks that are older than some of these kids are. And he was basically saying, give them a break, engage in their arguments, but don't personalize the attacks against them. And since I heard that, I wrote him a note when I got to the office, the email, and thanked him for doing that and praising him for doing that. And knowing that his audience, which is a pretty energized audience, may be resistance to that message. And he wrote back and he said, thanks. But he said, I want you to know that voice that you heard on the radio has been shaped by you. Mm. And that was an admission by him, and true of me as well, which was there was a greater mutual understanding. And we've had a lot of exchange. I just got a note from him today, actually, in terms of comparing thoughts and views. Some things we agree with, some things we don't, but sometimes he'll call me, in a sense, because he has private doubts that he wouldn't be wise for him in his estimation to express publicly, but he wants to share it with somebody. And so, I don't know how you do that writ large, but I do know on a more micro level, that's the way that kind of stuff has to happen. And some of it is, I would say, to view political conversations like, marriage conversations or intimate relationship conversations. If you're, have a spouse and they're upset at something you've done, and they detect from you that you're not listening to them, or you're not understanding them, or you come back with your own set of grievances, that conversation ain't going to end well. Mm. You have to have people who are try as best they can. Nobody does it perfectly. It was as best you can to listen well to other people, to make people feel, that they're being treated with some degree of dignity. Often, in my experience, if you can tell people what you think you've just heard or what they've just said in a way that resonates with them, that helps, because then you're sort of saying, okay, that person at least gets where I'm coming from.
Right. Yeah. So much of what you're saying makes a ton of sense. I think you summed it up. You were quoting Peter Coleman from Columbia when you said, how can we do this? By listening well and berating others less. But to your point, I don't think that there's something that is really satisfying in the moment of throwing one of those rhetorical grenades and feeling like you're scoring one for your team.
Right.
But I think it's only exacerbating much of the problem. You're not doing anything productive. Whereas, and I've experienced this too. I've shared a story about one of my kids. He just turned 18, eventually decided not to get the vaccine. But one of the reasons that he did that was because when he was coming to his decision, he was initially saying, well, I don't want to be a lab test. So he was thinking that maybe he'll wait till FDA approval. In the meantime, he got beat up so bad, including by me, harassed and shamed. And he finally decided, no, kind of an immature reaction to it, to have that be the defining, to allow that to define his ultimate decision. But I understood. And I also understood that because I participated in the dog pile on the rabbit, I lost my privilege to engage with him about it. And then finally I approached him much later. I think it was in the fall. And I said, look, man, let me just hear you. I just want to understand. And that's when I came to the understanding that, beating him up and harassing him and shaming him was counterproductive.
Yeah, it's a lovely story.
Yeah.
It's a good model for parenting. So much I think of parenting and human relationships, but in the context of what you're saying of parenting is not that you get everything perfect, you don't make mistakes. It's how you deal with it afterward. I think that probably in the end is a better teacher for children. I think they learn more if they see adults do exactly what you did, which is to come back and say, look, I didn't handle this exactly right. Let me hear you better. Because we're all gonna screw up in that. We do it all the time. So it's a lovely story.
But I also think that work can be done with our neighbors when it comes to social and political issues, or in our walk. I even as evangel, I still consider myself an evangelical, but I think that there are folks who study Josh McDowell, Lee Strobel, Ravi, in order to be able to get into that magical conversation where you're going to convince somebody within an hour to give their Lord to Jesus Christ, their Lord and Savior. I just don't think that's how it happens. Maybe it does, but even then, I would be suspicious of how deep the roots are, to refer to the parable. But I think that it's more to do with something you were describing before, and I kept on thinking of the phrase salt and light. And there's a story of 2 salt granules in a salt shaker, and one is a younger one is an older one. The younger one is getting freaked out because all he knows is that every time they pick up the shaker, their friends are pouring out of it, and they're all just disintegrating, never to be seen or heard from again. And just the older one finally says, that may well be, but if I get shaken into that pot or whatever it is, that water and the stuff in that pot will never be the same again.
Wow.
So I do think that what you did with your friend, listening, understanding, reflecting back to them what you think you understand, is a way of being that kind of salt, that it gives you that credibility to every once in a while. A friend recently who disagrees with me on some things, a very, very left atheist, interesting person, started one of these with, let me gently posit, but we had enough of a rapport where when she said that, I was like, okay, yeah, cool. Let's do it.
Yeah. I
think there's good work to be done if listening well and berating others less is one of those compass things. So
that is the Coleman I think approach, and also John Haidt and several others. I've told people that I've learned more from psychology, social psychology, actually clinical psychology or psychologists over the last decade in understanding this political moment, much more from psychology than I have from political scientists. And others. I think probably as a general matter, I didn't fully appreciate how important human psychology was to politics, but I think particularly at this moment. So when I've talked to people like John Haidt and John Rausch, who did a wonderful book called Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth, or read people like Coleman, who I wasn't aware of until John Haidt had introduced me to his work. That kind of stuff is very, very helpful to me, just to understand what's the dynamic going on, how our brains wired, why do we react, the way that we do. And this is true not just for me in political conversations, but also faith conversations, theological conversations. To try, you begin to understand when you're having discussions, at least in my experience, with people on issues, and there's a particular intensity around those issues. It's not really the issue per se, it's what's underneath it. And those conversations, those issues are proxies for core identity. And so if you disagree with somebody on an issue, and you may think, well, this is puzzling, we just have a disagreement on X issue, gun control, feminism, even abortion, or, what the right posture should be toward Ukraine, so forth. And you think, wow, this is pretty intense over an issue. It's because there's a core identity that's attached. So if they feel like their views are under attack, they feel like their core identity is under attack. And whenever we feel that, if we feel that someone is attacking us at our core, our belief system or something else, that elicits a very strong and often emotional response, and different parts of our brain begin to take over.
That's interesting. I think you referenced some studies that have been done about how intelligent. I think Dana Milbeck may have referenced similar studies or similar scholars who are working on this, how otherwise really intelligent people can come to views that are so at odds with reality. And it's in the field of psychology. So I'm going to have to dive into that and maybe reach out to some of those scholars so I can understand it better. But it's like a cognitive dissonance on steroids in a way.
Yeah. Actually, it's interesting. Often it's more dangerous for very intelligent people. They're more susceptible to it because their intelligence can allow them to rationalize some really bizarre ideas in ways that are more difficult to rationalize for people who are not as intelligent. It doesn't have to do with intelligence, being susceptible to conspiracy theories and wild beliefs. It's not an IQ matter. It's about a lot of other things: disposition, temperament, life experience, communities that we're a part of, all sorts of different things. So it's sometimes people are really shocked that intelligent people seem to believe certain things that just seem counter to science and reality. I remember having a conversation with a good friend, a very bright guy, during COVID. This would have been summer of 2020. And he was absolutely convinced that hydroxychloroquine was the cure to COVID. And there was nothing I could say, no CDC study that I could send him that would change his mind. He was just absolutely committed. And he was living in an epistemological world where all of those biases were confirmed. And he was reading, he was listening to this nurse on YouTube or that person making the case for hydroxychloroquine. We know objectively that it didn't cure COVID, just like ivermectin. We now know that there's just a recent study that came out said it had no difference compared to placebos. But that didn't matter, partly because there's trust in authority, and this person decided didn't matter what the CDC or the FDA or the National Institutes of Health said or what Francis Collins said. They're part of the establishment, and I'm choosing to believe a different set of experts, and so that's a challenge.
Yeah. Well, I could do this all day. I mean, as evidenced by the fact that I don't think I asked even 10% of the questions that I had prepared. This has been a great, but I do have two more questions.
Sure.
One is, do you have any other questions for me?
Yeah, I'd be curious if you could identify change. How are you different in your faith journey now than, say, 10 years ago? What have you learned, or are there certain views that you've calibrated, whether doctrinally or otherwise? How are you a different person in terms of your faith journey now as opposed to, say, 10 years ago?
There's a lot more salt. I'm a lot more salty. No, that's wow. I'd have to go back and read some of the journals from 10 years ago, but I think I am more at ease with the fact that I have questions. I am more at ease with that which I'm uneasy about. It may sound ironic, but when I was reading, before I became a Christian, I had this voracious reading habit that led to me becoming a Christian. Because I had these questions that I felt palpably, which makes sense if you believe, the greatest commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. If these questions are existential, you're going to feel it in your heart, soul, mind, and physically, right? And to the extent that there were certain questions that were painful. I think I may have shared this with you. I think when I first reached out, that there are certain works that were salves for me, like the third volume of N.T. Wright's big books, the one on the resurrection. Yeah, that really helped me get more settled with the idea of an open universe and a creator God that can act inside of his universe, and that. I don't have to necessarily buy everything that looks like a miracle per se, but there are some that that was a miracle and Jesus bodily rose from the dead. I became much more at ease with that possibility. And there were a lot of other questions. I think also they were partly theological, but more sociological, because my kids were still in a Christian school where, there was an incident. This must have been about 10 years ago when, during the Mitt Romney campaign. And strangely, like Romney Ryan were one of my favorite tickets of all time. But there was this community event. We had a speaker at the kids' school that I thought was going to be talking about the history of communism. She came from a Eastern European country, but her entire talk was about how Barack Hussein Obama, she made a point of saying Hussein, was actually a Marxist, communist, possibly a terrorist. And at the end of the thing, the school is a classical Christian education. That's, their kind of core pillars of who they are. I just got up and I said, well, what does this have to do with classical Christian education? And boy, oh boy, I got shouted down. I got threatened out in the parking lot just for asking the question. But these sociological questions of who are we as a people? Who are we primarily as a people? Are we primarily pro-Republican or pro, I don't know, I forget who the prominent conservative figures were, pro-Rush, pro-Sean Hannity, whoever it might have been. Or are we pro-Bible? Are we pro-God? Are we pro-Jesus? Are we pro like doing this redemption project thing together? So those were much more not just palpable, but painful at times. And I think I'm more at ease with understanding, with being uncomfortable with certain things and understanding that I'm going to explore some of these questions I have and problems that I'm grappling with, and that it's a journey. And when I breathe my last, I'll still probably have some questions, I was sharing with somebody yesterday about a play that I wrote, and it's now 30 years ago. It's called Till the Day I Die. I'd have to change the title if we republished it, but because Odette's wrote a play of a very similar title. But the first half of the play is in the around the deathbed of a patriarchal figure in a family, and the audience is in the perspective of the eyes of the person on his deathbed. And then the second act is a year later at the unveiling of the grave. It's a Jewish family, not so surprisingly. And the character that I identified with back then was having a conversation with the ghost of his father, who was sitting on his gravestone, and they were just talking about it. And I bring it up because it reminded me of what are some of the things that I'm going to be thinking about on my own deathbed, And I don't know, there's sort of a Neil Simon-esque kind of quality to the kinds of things I think I might be thinking of. But most of all, it's just, I'll still probably have questions if I'm thinking. But if I am thinking cogently and wisely, I feel myself going more in the direction of some of what Heschel talked about in his book on the Sabbath, the appreciation of the sanctity in the mundane, and the appreciation of just being with those I love. So, so off the top of my head, it's a profound question. I wish I had I might want to write an essay so I can be more articulate.
Well, that's a very, very nice answer. It's interesting. I had a coffee with somebody I'd met. I'd spoken at a church a couple of years ago when I stayed in touch with this person. So we had coffee the other day, and he used a description which may resonate with you. He was talking about how different theological templates are invoked by different people, and he talked about those that he's come across in the Christian world who view faith in a sort of formulaic way, like 2 + 2 = 4, and he was more drawn than he had been in the past to the mystery of faith, the mystery of Scripture, and the mystery of God, and that he found himself pushing away from those who tried to give a formulaic mathematical answer to every question, every difficult question under the sun, theodicy, why do good people suffer, There are an endless number of them, and that there are some people in the journey of faith who just want it to be neat and tidy and think that the answers are very obvious. Maybe they are, but for a lot of us, they're not. And there is something about the whole notion of the mystery and the drama, and we're part of a story and a narrative. We're not part of a set of philosophical precepts. That's not what the story of faith is.
Yeah. I'm another one of the things I'm not comfortable with is those simple answers, those simple equations that can get you to, because I think it opens up the door for us to outsource our thinking.
Yeah.
And maybe it's my Jewish background that it's almost like as a Jew, if you're not suffering, you're not trying. I'm a little bit more at home in that realm. But I guess the last question I have is, how can we find you online, or find more about all the great work that you're doing?
Oh, well, you kind of ask. My main outlets are the Atlantic magazine and the New York Times. So if you Google my name and do the Atlantic and the New York Times, they keep a history of most of what I've written for them, and those are two great outlets for me. And I've written a lot about faith. You were alluding to some of the pieces I've written for the Times in the past, but also for the Atlantic. Interesting thing with the Times is that I've probably written between 12 and 15 real, I would say, theological meditations. That is, it's not politics and faith. It's meditations, reflections, thinking my way through questions like, where's God in the midst of suffering, the resurrection, the crucifixion, grace, humility, the mode of conversation. Why did Jesus use parables and ask so many questions, and so forth? And so they've been very, very good about that. And I have a wonderful editor there, as well as a wonderful editor at the Atlantic. And so I'm a fortunate writer. I get to write what's on my mind and heart, and they're encouraging and supportive.
That's terrific. You probably hear Charles Mingus III in the background now.
Oh, we've got Romeo, so I know exactly the kind of thing you're dealing with there.
Yeah, it's all good. Like I said, I have so much more questions, but I'm going to have to invite you back if you would be so kind to come back. But I just really appreciate this conversation. I appreciate you taking the time. I will definitely put links in the show notes for the book. For the Atlantic, $59.99, by the way, for the digital subscription. A lot of other great writers in there, David French among them. David Brooks in the Times also writes theological reflections in there, in addition to his sociological observations. Just some great writers that have definitely helped me work through my own thinking and enrich my life in very real, practical ways. So I just appreciate you. It's such a thrill to get to talk to someone who's already been an influence on me and my thinking. So I'm really grateful to you.
I've really enjoyed the conversation. I'd love to come back and take care. And thanks for sharing your own story.
Yeah, that's terrific. And as always, if you dig what we're doing here, please hit that subscribe button, leave a review and comments wherever you get your podcasts, and tell a friend about TP&R. We're easier to recommend than ever. It's politicsandreligion.us. politicsandreligion.us. You can even support our program through the Patreon app on our site. Now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week. Thank you for joining us today. If you dig what we're doing here, it is super easy to follow us. You can go to our site, politicsandreligion.us. That's with the "and" spelled out, A-N-D. politicsandreligion.us. And we're on all the socials at TP and R Pod. TP and R Pod for Talking Politics and Religion Pod. And here's a big way you can support us: by becoming one of our patrons. You can even become a producer or executive producer of our program and have a lot more say in who we bring on, the kinds of questions we explore, or just help us keep the lights on. But mostly, we really appreciate you giving us a listen. So for the whole team here at Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other, thanks for hanging out with us. We'll be back in a few days to do our little part in Tikkun Olam.